which also brings us to the subject of Abraham Lincoln, who of course is maybe like the decisive figure in this class, if not in U.S. history as a whole. And in class, you mentioned this quotation from Charles Sumner. It was something along the lines of, like, Lincoln has his problem, but he's facing Zionward. And I wonder...
It was the other way around. That was Lincoln on the radicals.
Oh, okay.
That was Lincoln's comment on the Missouri radicals. They are devils, but they're facing Zionward.
But it gets to the same point, which I wonder,
Right.
like, do you see this... I feel like this kind of encapsulates your line on Lincoln, which is Lincoln and his relationship with the radicals, which is, all right, real substantive differences on policy, but same overall ends, or at least parallel ends. Does that make sense?
Well, in a way it does. You know, I don't want to sugarcoat the fact that many radicals were very critical of Lincoln at many points during the war, and indeed they nominated their own candidate in the spring of 1864, which certainly suggests that they would have been happy to be rid of Lincoln. On the other hand, I do Lincoln, you know, there's a lot of literature. When you write about Lincoln or talk about Lincoln, more than almost any other figure, there is this vast historiography behind you that you have to somehow, in a sense, relate to or comment on or decide whether you agree with it or not. Part of that historiography, a good chunk of it, puts the Lincoln and the radicals as antagonists and as opposites. Lincoln is the pragmatic political figure who understands how to get things done. The radicals are fanatics, they're outside the system, they're just agitators, and they are a pain in the neck to Lincoln, basically. I think that's a complete misreading of the situation. There were very important differences, but Lincoln needed the radicals in a certain sense, and the radicals needed Lincoln too. I think their relationship was much more symbiotic than antagonistic. But Lincoln had to deal with others. You could write a book, Lincoln and the Conservatives. You know, he had many pressures upon him, above or beyond what the radicals were doing.
And did Lincoln need the radicals in particular, or did he need everyone he could get at the time?
Well, what I mean is he needed the radicals because the radicals were pressing for the most vigorous kind of conduct of the war. They were pressing for emancipation. They were pressing for an active military policy. They were pressing for black soldiers. When I say Lincoln needed them, I think Lincoln was a kind of person who actually thrived on difference of opinion, you know, and he needed constructive criticism. And that's what the radicals are giving him much of the time. Occasionally their criticism is not that constructive, but most of the time they are pushing him to be more successful, so to speak, in conducting the war, whereas Davis did not have that kind of opposition in the South. He had states' rights opposition, he had personal opposition, he had a lot of complaints, but he didn't have a coherent group trying to press him to make the war more effective, so to speak.
But that brings up the nature of the opposition that both Lincoln and Davis had to deal with. And this is a point that you've emphasized repeatedly in class, that with the Civil War, sort of reformers and other radicals are sort of brought into the Union in a major way. And it seems like Davis, it's almost like, you know, he has to deal with the threat of secession internally all the time as well, that there's no sort of signing on to this Confederate national project in a weird way.
Well, you know, I did talk about it in the lecture, and maybe I didn't give Davis enough credit. You know, no one ever gives Davis credit. After all, you know, he lost. So, particularly in America, that he's a loser. But you know, there was the Confederates had a lot of internal problems. On the other hand, they did manage to create a fairly consolidated national state. They managed to create an arms industry from nothing. A kind of socialistic one where the government just set up factories to produce weaponry for the military. Let's go back to whether the Civil War was a revolution. Long ago, Emory Thomas, excellent historian, wrote a book called The Confederacy as a Revolutionary Experience. And his argument was the Confederacy, almost without even saying it, actually rejected the Old South and created a consolidated state, a centralized state. Even while they talked about states' rights, it actually revolutionized the Southern political system. Now, this was a revolution that was completely aborted. In other words, with the end of the war, the Confederate state obviously was...
It revolutionized it because it was forced by the pressures of war to be a centralized, advancing state.
Right, to be a modern state as best it could rather than just a collection of discrete local forces. And that produced a lot of opposition. But, if you look at what they did in building factories, in issuing currency, in borrowing money, in having a draft, which is certainly a major step of national consolidation, and in a way in having a figure, not Davis, but Robert E. Lee, really, who becomes the national symbol, the person that everybody in the South, white anyway, kind of identifies with or looks up to. So there were many elements of modern nationhood in the or actually Thomas's history, which he wrote later, of the Confederacy is called the Confederate Nation. In other words, there was an old South, and then there was a Confederate nation, and they weren't the same thing. Now, having said that, I think the problem that they face is that the nature of the opposition within the South was much more dire for their purposes than opposition in the North. There was plenty of division in the North, as we know, but you didn't have, first of all, 3.5 million slaves or 3.5 million people who wanted the other side to win. You have a large part of the population in the South that actually identifies with the enemy. And then even among many whites, there was growing dissatisfaction with the war, growing resistance to the war, growing desertion from the army. There were plenty of desertions from the Northern Army too, obviously, and there was plenty of criticism of Lincoln, but you didn't have a lot of people in the North who wanted the South to win. And I think so that the opposition in the South was more extreme in that sense and posed a far greater problem for a leader like Davis than the opposition in the North, even though Lincoln had a lot of trouble dealing with them also.